Hey, so tonight, we're exploring one of history's most incredible survival stories, one that'll make you grateful for that warm bed you're lying in. Picture this. We're diving into the tale of the 710 brave souls who lived to tell about April 15th, 1912, when the impossible happened and the unsinkable ship met its match in the North Atlantic. This is their story of courage, human spirit, and remarkable endurance against overwhelming odds. Oh, and if you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. Super curious where you're all listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Always blows my mind how people are falling asleep to this all over the world. All right, find that cozy spot, take a nice slow breath, and just let your body sink into whatever you're lying in. We're heading back to April 1912 to explore one of history's most fascinating survival stories. And trust me, you're going to appreciate that solid ground beneath you even more by the time we're done. So let's explore this incredible historical tale together. We'll follow the experiences of those who lived through the events aboard the RMS Titanic on that famous night. It's 11:35 p.m. on April 14th, 1912, and we're about to witness one of history's most remarkable demonstrations of human resilience and courage in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. Our story begins in luxury beyond anything most people can imagine. The first-class accommodations aboard the Titanic represented the absolute pinnacle of Edwardian elegance and technological achievement. These weren't just hotel rooms. They were floating palaces that cost passengers the equivalent of $75,000 in today's money for the finest suites. The staterooms were masterpieces of craftsmanship and comfort. The walls were lined with rich mahogany paneling, each piece carefully selected and hand-polished to a mirror finish. The electric lighting, still a marvel in 1912, came from cut crystal fixtures that cast warm, golden light throughout these luxurious spaces. The carpets were genuine Persian wool, so thick that footsteps made no sound as passengers moved about their accommodations. The beds were works of art, massive four-poster frames crafted from the finest English oak, dressed with Irish linens that were woven specifically for the White Star Line. The sheets had thread counts that most modern luxury hotels would envy, and the down comforters contained feathers from specially bred European geese. The pillows were filled with the softest down money could buy, and each bed ensemble probably cost more than what a working-class family earned in an entire year. But it wasn't just the luxury that was remarkable. It was the technology. These staterooms had electric lights controlled by switches on the wall, a convenience that many homes on land still didn't possess. There were telephones connected to the ship's internal system, allowing passengers to contact other parts of the vessel or reach the crew for service. The heating system used steam from the ship's boilers, distributed through pipes hidden within the walls, maintaining comfortable temperatures even in the middle of the North Atlantic in April. The private bathrooms attached to the luxury suites were equally impressive. They featured full-sized bathtubs made of the finest porcelain, with taps that provided both hot and cold running water, another luxury that many land-based establishments couldn't match. The fixtures were plated with real gold, and the mirrors were the highest quality glass available, imported from Belgium specifically for the ship. Through the large porthole windows, passengers could see the dark ocean stretching endlessly in all directions. During the day, this view had been magnificent, an unbroken horizon where sky met water in a perfect line. Now, in the darkness of night, it was more mysterious than beautiful, with only the reflection of stateroom lights on the glass to remind occupants that they were enclosed in this floating world of luxury and advanced technology. The silence that awakened many passengers wasn't quite natural. For 4 days since leaving Southampton, the ship had been filled with constant subtle sounds. The rhythmic thrumming of the massive engines deep in the hull, the whisper of air moving through the ventilation systems, the distant sounds of other passengers and crew going about their business. But now, something had changed. The engine noise, that steady mechanical heartbeat that passengers had grown accustomed to, had stopped completely. This silence was different from what anyone would experience on land. It wasn't the quiet of a house at night, broken by familiar sounds like settling timbers or distant traffic. This was the silence of a mechanical marvel that had suddenly ceased its normal operation, surrounded by thousands of miles of empty ocean. It was a quiet that carried undertones of concern, even if passengers couldn't immediately identify why. Many passengers rose from their luxurious beds, feet finding thick Persian carpets, the floors. Observant passengers noticed with growing concern weren't quite level. It was subtle, so slight that it might have been attributed to imagination if they weren't paying close attention. But there was definitely a gentle forward slope that hadn't been there when they retired for the evening hours earlier. Moving to the portholes, passengers peered out into the darkness, and what they saw didn't immediately make sense. Floating past in the moonlight were chunks of ice, not small pieces that might be expected in these waters, but massive, irregular shapes that caught the moon's reflection like scattered diamonds against the black water. Some of these ice formations were enormous, easily the size of buildings, drifting past the ship's hull with stately, ominous grace. Icebergs in the North Atlantic weren't uncommon in April. Experienced mariners knew to expect them during this season as the Greenland ice sheet shed its winter accumulation. But seeing them this close to the ship, floating past at what seemed like close quarters, created an uneasy feeling among those who witnessed them. Surely the ship's officers would maintain a safe distance from such natural hazards. The Titanic was equipped with the latest navigation technology and staffed by experienced officers who understood these waters well. As passengers watched, trying to make sense of what they were seeing, a gentle vibration ran through the ship's structure. It wasn't violent or immediately alarming, more like the tremor one might feel when a heavy truck passes by a house. Just a subtle shuddering that caused water in bedside crystal carafes to ripple for a moment before returning to stillness. The vibration passed, and the ship returned to that unnatural quiet. The engine still silent. Something was clearly happening, and natural curiosity overrode any inclination to return to bed. After all, passengers had paid substantial sums for this voyage, not just for transportation, but for the experience of traveling aboard the most advanced, most luxurious ship ever built. They had every right to understand what was causing this unusual situation. Passengers dressed quickly but properly. Even in the middle of the night, standards of appropriate attire had to be maintained, particularly in first-class accommodations where they might encounter other passengers or crew members. They slipped into heavy wool dressing gowns over their nightclothes and added leather house slippers that would provide some protection on the ship's polished floors. The corridors outside the staterooms were dimly lit by electric wall sconces that cast pools of warm light along the mahogany-paneled walls. Everything appeared normal at first glance, the same elegant decorative elements that had impressed passengers when they first boarded in Southampton. Carved pillars supported ornate ceiling moldings, and thick carpet runners down the centers of the hallways muffled footsteps. But there was something different about the atmosphere, a tension that hadn't been present during normal evening hours. As passengers made their way toward the ship's central areas, they encountered their first human signs that something unusual was occurring. Stewards hurried past, their usually impeccable uniforms showing signs of haste, jackets unbuttoned, collars slightly askew, normally perfect posture showing strain. When approached for information about the situation, they paused, clearly weighing their words carefully. "Nothing to cause alarm, sir," became a standard response, though voices carried tension that contradicted these reassuring words. "We've stopped temporarily for a routine inspection. Engineering matters, you understand," We're quite certain operations will resume shortly. But their eyes told different stories. There was something there. Not panic, but definitely heightened concern. A knowledge of developing circumstances that they weren't authorized or perhaps not ready to share with passengers. They hurried away before detailed questions could be asked, leaving passengers alone in corridors, with growing senses that whatever was happening was more significant than routine inspection. Passengers continued toward the grand staircase, that magnificent centerpiece of the ship's first-class accommodations. This architectural marvel rose through multiple decks, a sweeping curve of hand-carved English oak that during daylight hours was crowned by an enormous glass dome. The dome allowed natural light to flood down through the ship's levels, creating bright, airy atmospheres that made the interior feel more like luxury hotels than ships. Now, illuminated by electric chandeliers, the grand staircase took on different characters. The warm artificial light created dramatic shadows and highlights that emphasized the craftsmanship of every carved detail. The bronze cherub at the base of the main landing, holding an electric torch aloft, seemed to glow with inner light. The whole space had almost cathedral-like qualities that would be beautiful under normal circumstances but now felt somehow ominous. Other passengers were beginning to emerge from their staterooms, most dressed in nightwear similar to what anyone might expect. There was Mrs. Eleanor Widner, whom many had met at the captain's dinner the previous evening, an elegant woman from Philadelphia whose family had made their fortune in public transportation. She approached others in an expensive silk robe, her usually perfect composure showing the first hairline cracks of concern. "Have you heard anything specific about our current situation?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying the cultured tones of Philadelphia society, but with an undercurrent of worry. "The crew members I've encountered are being rather circumspect about sharing information." Before anyone could respond, groups of men emerged from the direction of the boat deck, and their faces immediately told stories that words hadn't yet conveyed. These were first-class passengers, men accustomed to having control over their circumstances and access to information. But now their expressions showed mixtures of disbelief and growing alarm that were impossible to misinterpret. Among them was Harry Whittier, Mrs. Whittier's son, a bibliophile and collector who had been in London acquiring rare books for his personal library. His face was pale in the chandelier light, and when he saw his mother, his expression became grave, in a way that immediately communicated the seriousness of the developing situation. "Mother, we need to return to our staterooms immediately and dress warmly," he said, his voice carefully controlled but unable to completely mask his concern. "The warmest clothing we have with us. The ship has encountered some significant difficulties. The officers are preparing comprehensive safety measures." The phrase "safety measures" hung in the air like a physical presence. Safety measures on the Titanic, the ship that had been marketed as practically unsinkable, whose revolutionary design featured 16 watertight compartments that could be sealed independently. The ship that represented the absolute pinnacle of maritime engineering and safety technology. Mrs. Whitner's hand moved involuntarily to her throat, a gesture that spoke of growing apprehension. How serious are these difficulties? Her son's pause before answering told the story even before he spoke. Serious enough that they're asking families to prepare for the possibility of precautionary boat procedures. The officers estimate we have adequate time to make proper preparations, but they're recommending immediate action. The words hit like a series of physical blows. Boat procedures, precautionary measures. These were euphemisms for something that seemed difficult to contemplate. The possibility that passengers might need to leave this floating palace and trust their lives to smaller vessels on the open Atlantic Ocean. "I should return to my stateroom," became a common response, as passengers found themselves surprised by how calm their voices sounded despite growing alarm. "Gather appropriate clothing for whatever this situation requires," The walks back to staterooms took on surreal qualities. The ship still felt solid and stable. Still felt like the engineering marvel that had impressed everyone when they first boarded. The electric lights continued to burn brightly. The heating system still maintained comfortable temperatures throughout the passages, and the luxurious appointments still spoke of wealth, technology, and human achievement. But now passengers were acutely aware of subtle changes they'd missed before. The slight forward tilt was more pronounced. Not dramatic, but definitely present. Objects that had been perfectly positioned when they left their rooms now sat at perceptible angles. Crystal water pitchers on nightstands had shifted position. And when passengers looked out portholes, horizons seemed somehow different, as if the normal relationship between ship and sea had been altered. In their staterooms, passengers dressed with new urgency and purpose. If they were going to spend time in open boats on the North Atlantic in April, they would need every advantage that proper preparation could provide. The weather had been cold but manageable during the voyage, with daytime temperatures in the 50s and nighttime temperatures dropping toward freezing. But on the open ocean, without the protection of heated ship interiors, those temperatures would become challenging very quickly. Passengers started with wool undergarments, long underwear, and wool socks that would provide base layers of insulation. Over those, their heaviest suits, made of thick wool tweeds that were tailored specifically for cooler weather expected in New York. Over the suits, wool vests, and then heavy overcoats. Substantial garments lined with fur that had been packed for the anticipated cooler spring weather in America. The life preservers, those bulky cork vests that had seemed like amusing novelties during mandatory safety demonstrations, now took on critical importance. Passengers struggled to fit them over all their layers of clothing, and they made movement awkward and cumbersome. But if the unthinkable was really happening, these ungainly devices represented essential safety equipment as passengers prepared. They could hear sound from other staterooms, voices, footsteps, the opening and closing of doors. Other travelers were clearly going through similar preparations, and the normal quiet of nighttime hours was being replaced by the bustle of people, responding to an emergency that no one yet fully understood. The ship's list, that subtle forward inclination, was becoming more noticeable. As passengers moved around their staterooms, they found themselves unconsciously adjusting their balance to compensate for the angle. It was still gentle enough that it didn't interfere significantly with normal movement, but it was definitely present and seemed to be increasing gradually. Knocks at stateroom doors interrupted preparations. Ship's officers arrived, still maintaining the professional bearing and immaculate appearance that White Star Line personnel were famous for. But observant passengers could see strain around their eyes and tension in their postures. We're requesting all passengers to make their way to the boat deck as quickly as possible, they said in the clipped, professional tones of British maritime service. Please bring only essential items and dress as warmly as circumstances permit. The evening air is quite cold. When passengers asked about time frames, responses were measured and professional. We have adequate time for everyone to prepare properly. This is a precautionary measure. The ship's watertight compartment system is functioning as designed, but we're implementing standard safety protocols as matters of proper procedure. These words were professionally delivered and technically accurate, but they didn't answer underlying questions about the ultimate seriousness of the situation. If the watertight compartments were functioning properly, why implement boat procedures at all? If this was truly routine, why the emphasis on warm clothing and urgency? Passengers grabbed essential items, wallets, jewelry, important papers, and prepared to leave the staterooms that had been their homes for 4 days. As many took last looks around these luxurious spaces, they had odd premonitions that they might never see them again. The thoughts seemed melodramatic, almost silly, but they persisted as doors were closed and journeys began back toward the ship's central areas. The scenes that greeted passengers at the Grand staircase had transformed dramatically in the short time since they'd returned to their rooms. What had been gatherings of curious, concerned passengers had become something resembling organized. Evacuations. The elegant central spaces of the ship were now filled with people in various states of dress, some in evening wear, hastily covered with coats and wraps, others in heavy outdoor clothing that suggested they better understood the gravity of developing situations. Families clustered together, parents holding children who seemed more excited than frightened by this unusual nighttime adventure. The children didn't yet understand the implications of what was happening to them. This was an interesting break in routine rather than a potential crisis. Their excitement and chatter created odd counterpoints to the barely controlled anxiety visible on adult faces. The ship's orchestra had assembled near the base of the grand staircase and begun playing music. This wasn't unusual musical entertainment. Was a standard feature of first-class accommodations aboard luxury liners, but their selection of cheerful, familiar melodies seemed both comforting and somehow determined. An attempt to maintain normalcy in circumstances that were anything but normal. Passengers joined streams of people making their way toward the boat deck, following signs and directions from crew members who were working to maintain order while managing what was clearly an unprecedented situation. The promenade deck, which during pleasant weather had been a favorite spot for strolling and observing the ocean, now felt exposed and more serious than usual. The first thing that struck passengers about the boat deck was the temperature change. It had dropped significantly since the ship stopped moving, and without the protection of heated interior spaces, the wind cut through even heavy clothing. Breath became visible in small puffs of vapor, and everyone felt grateful for every layer they had managed to put on. The lifeboats themselves presented an odd mixture of reassurance and concern. During the daytime, they'd seemed like standard safety equipment, almost decorative in their neat arrangement along the ship's sides. Now they represented the primary safety system for everyone aboard. Yet they looked surprisingly small and delicate compared to the massive ship they were attached to. Each lifeboat was suspended from mechanical davits, complex pulley systems. That allowed the boats to be lowered to the water's surface 65 feet below. In calm conditions with experienced crew, this was a routine operation. But in the middle of the night, with passengers who had no experience with such procedures, every aspect of the process became more complicated and required careful attention. Officers with megaphones were attempting to organize the growing crowd of passengers. "We are implementing standard maritime safety procedures," came the announcements, delivered in calm, professional tones designed to maintain order. "Please form orderly groups near each boat station. Families with children and elderly passengers will receive priority assistance." The phrase about priorities reflected the social values of 1912, the belief that in times of crisis, the most vulnerable members of society deserve protection first. This wasn't just policy. It was a fundamental principle of civilized behavior that no proper person would question. But it also created emotional scenarios for families who understood they might face separation. Near lifeboat number 7. Passengers observed scenes that captured both the tragedy and the nobility of human nature under extreme stress. A young mother, probably not much older than 25, stood holding a toddler while her husband attempted to comfort both of them. She was clearly concerned at the prospect of leaving him behind. But the alternative, keeping her child aboard a ship that might be experiencing serious difficulties, was unthinkable. "This is just a precautionary measure," he told her, his voice steady despite the worry observers could see in his eyes. "The officers know what they're doing. I'll join you in the next boat. We'll all be sharing stories about this adventure tomorrow morning over breakfast in New York." His words carried hope and determination. Though those nearby were close enough to see the uncertainty he was working to hide, she nodded, wanting desperately to believe him, and allowed herself to be helped into the boat. The sound of that lifeboat being lowered away, the creaking of ropes, the scrape of wood against the ship's steel hull, and finally the distant splash as it reached the water far below emphasized just how far it was to the ocean surface and how small these boats were in relation to the vast sea around them. When passengers approached officers supervising the boat loading to ask about capacity and procedures, they encountered young men, probably in their early 30s, with the weathered faces of people who had spent their careers at sea. Their uniforms were immaculate despite the circumstances, and they maintained the professional demeanor that passengers expected. But there was stress visible in the tight lines around their eyes. "Excuse me, officer, but could you provide some information about the overall capacity of the boat system?" became a common question, phrased in ways designed not to cause panic among nearby families. Officers glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard by families with children, then spoke quietly. "Each boat is designed to hold 65 people when fully loaded. We have 14 standard lifeboats, plus 4 collapsible boats that can carry approximately 47 people each. In total, if we utilize every boat to absolute capacity, we can accommodate roughly 1,200 individuals." The mathematics hit passengers like physical blows. There were over 2,200 souls aboard the Titanic, passengers and crew combined. Even if every single boat was filled to its absolute maximum capacity, a significant portion of the people on this ship would not find places in them. The arithmetic was straightforward and sobering. "Surely, there are additional safety measures?" passengers asked, hoping for information about other options. Emergency procedures that might provide hope for those who wouldn't fit in the boats. Officers' expressions told stories before they spoke. The regulations that govern safety equipment for ships of this size were established based on older, smaller vessels. "The boat capacity we have exceeds legal requirements, but..." They didn't finish these sentences, but the implications hung in the frigid air. Looking around the boat deck with this new understanding, passengers began to see the situation with different perspectives. What had appeared to be organized confusion now revealed itself as carefully managed procedures under extraordinary circumstances. Some boats were being lowered only partially filled because women refused to leave their husbands, or because the crew was being cautious about weight limits during the lowering process. Meanwhile, other areas of the deck were filled with people, still trying to understand what was happening. The ship's list was becoming more pronounced with each passing minute. What had been a barely perceptible forward tilt was now noticeable to anyone paying attention. Objects moved across surfaces that should be level, and maintaining balance required conscious effort. More significantly, the gap between the boat deck and the water's surface was visibly shrinking as the forward sections of the ship settled deeper into the ocean. Near lifeboat number 4, passengers witnessed a scene that would remain etched in memories for the rest of their lives, however long those might be. Mrs. Isidore Strauss, wife of the Macy's department store owner and a woman of considerable social prominence, was being helped toward the boat by her husband and several crew members. The couple was elderly. He was 67. She was 63, and they had been married for over 40 years. As she reached the edge of the boat, Mrs. Strauss suddenly stopped. She looked at her husband, at the boat, at the dark water far below, and made a decision that transcended logic and self-preservation. "We have been living together for many years," she said, in a voice that carried clearly across the deck despite the wind and the sounds of the evacuation. "Where you go, I go. My place is with my husband." She stepped back from the lifeboat, and despite the urgent pleas of the officers, the entreaties of other passengers, and even her husband's gentle insistence that she save herself, she would not be moved. The couple stood together, hand in hand, as the boat was prepared for lowering without her. In that moment, observers understood that they were witnessing something that went far beyond individual acts of heroism or stubborn loyalty. They were seeing the emergence of more fundamental Human values under extreme pressure. When faced with ultimate challenges, some people make choices that defy rational self-interest but affirm deeper truths about love, commitment, and the things that make life worth living. The temperature continued dropping as the night progressed. Breath created increasingly thick clouds of vapor. And despite all the layers of clothing people had managed to put on, the cold was beginning to penetrate to everyone's core. Yet passengers knew this was still comfortable compared to what awaited anyone who ended up in the water. Experienced mariners spoke of the North Atlantic in April as presenting serious challenges to human endurance. A commotion near the ship's radio room drew attention. Two men in radio operator uniforms were speaking urgently with one of the ship's officers, and curious passengers edged closer hoping to overhear news about rescue vessels. What they heard instead provided both hope and sobering reality. The Carpathia acknowledges our distress calls. One of the operators was saying, his voice tight with controlled emotion. Captain Rostron is coming at maximum speed, but she's over 50 miles away, even pushing his engines beyond normal limits and taking risks with the ice fields. He won't reach our position for several hours. The time factor was significant. Passengers looked around at the gradually sinking ship, at the lifeboats that could accommodate less than half the people aboard, at the black water stretching endlessly in all directions. Several hours represented a considerable challenge under these circumstances. The officer receiving the report nodded grimly and issued instructions that revealed the seriousness of the situation. Send another CQD. Make sure they understand our condition continues to develop. If there are any other vessels in the area, we need them to respond immediately. The radio operators hurried back to their equipment, and passengers were left with the knowledge that help, while definitely coming, would arrive later than anyone would prefer. The Carpathia's captain was clearly doing everything humanly possible, racing through dangerous ice fields in the dark, pushing his ship beyond safe operating parameters, but physics and distance were unforgiving constraints. The orchestra continued playing, though observers noticed their selection had evolved from light entertainment to more serious pieces, hymns and classical music that seemed more appropriate to the gravity of the situation. The melody of Nearer, My God, to Thee drifted across the tilting deck, mixing with the sounds of davits creaking under the weight of loaded lifeboats, officers giving directions, and the underlying sounds of water moving within the ship's lower compartments. As passengers made their way to the port side of the ship, they encountered a different approach to the evacuation procedures. Here, Officer Charles Lytler was maintaining strict adherence to the women and children only policy. Unlike some other areas where men had been allowed into boats to assist with rowing or to keep families together, Lytler interpreted his orders literally: no men, period. A group of male passengers had gathered near lifeboat number 14, watching as their wives, daughters, and sisters were loaded aboard. The boat held 65 people when fully loaded, but like many of the others, it was being prepared for lowering with empty seats because some women refused to leave their menfolk behind. Among this group of men, passengers recognized several faces from the ship's social gatherings over the past 4 days. There was Benjamin Guggenheim, the mining heir whose family fortune was built on Colorado silver and copper. He had undergone a remarkable transformation since anyone had last seen him. Gone were the practical clothes and life jacket he had been wearing earlier. Instead, he was dressed in full evening attire, white tie and tails, as if he were preparing to attend the opera rather than face an uncertain situation. "We are prepared to meet this challenge as gentlemen," he said with remarkable composure, his words carrying a dignity that transcended the chaos surrounding him. His valet, Victor Giglio, stood beside him in similar formal attire, having made the same choice to face whatever came with elegance rather than desperation. The words settled over the group with a kind of peaceful acceptance for men like him, wealthy, powerful, accustomed to controlling their circumstances. This situation represented a complete inversion of normal life. All the money, influence, and social position in the world couldn't change the basic physics of displacement and buoyancy. Yet rather than raging against this powerlessness, he had chosen to meet his fate with grace. The ship's list had reached the point where normal movement was becoming more difficult. Passengers found themselves gripping railings and bulkheads to maintain balance as they moved around the deck. Items that weren't properly secured were beginning to slide across surfaces and impact obstacles. The sound of shifting objects mingled with the continuing music and the increasingly urgent directions of crew members. From positions near the bridge area, passengers could see people who hadn't yet made it to the boat deck. They were climbing upward from the lower sections of the ship as the forward areas continued settling deeper into the water. The scale of the developing situation was becoming clear. This wasn't a minor emergency that could be managed with routine procedures. This was a significant challenge to the most advanced maritime technology of the age, and there was no longer any possibility of simply continuing the voyage as planned. A young crew member, barely out of his teens, ran past carrying an armload of additional life preservers. His face showed the strain of someone working under extraordinary pressure. When passengers stopped him to ask about conditions in the lower areas of the ship, his professional composure finally showed cracks. "The mailroom is experiencing significant flooding," he said, his voice reflecting both emotion and exhaustion. "The squash court area is underwater. The water has reached E-deck and continues rising. They've sealed all the watertight doors. But the situation continues to develop. The ship is really experiencing serious difficulties. For the first time since this night began, the full reality hit many passengers with crushing force. The Titanic, this floating city, this triumph of human engineering and ambition, was not going to limp into port for repairs. She was not going to stay afloat until rescue ships arrived in the hours ahead. This 882-foot-long marvel of technology was going to face a challenge that might prove beyond her capabilities. Passengers thought about their staterooms, with their mahogany paneling and crystal fixtures and Persian carpets now being invaded by the waters of the North Atlantic. Their belongings, the books they brought for the voyage, the gifts they purchased in London for friends in New York, the business documents that seemed so critically important when they boarded just 4 days ago, all of it potentially becoming waterlogged debris. But material possessions seemed less important now compared to the human drama unfolding around them. Near lifeboat number 12, a young woman faced a difficult choice. She had an infant child, and there was room in the boat for both of them, but her husband wouldn't be allowed to accompany them. The officer supervising the loading was sympathetic but inflexible. The boat was for women and children only, and he had orders that he intended to follow precisely. Her emotional response cut through the wind as she was helped into the boat. Her husband's final words, partially lost in the activity and sounds of the evacuation, "Take care of our son," was what observers could make out clearly. Tell him his father loves him. The deck beneath everyone's feet shuddered with a different quality of movement than the gradual settling they had been experiencing. Something significant had shifted deep in the ship's hull, allowing water to rush into previously dry compartments. The forward list increased noticeably, and suddenly walking required real effort. More like climbing uphill than moving on a level surface. Many passengers made their way toward the stern, where the deck angle was still manageable and hundreds of people had gathered. The crowd included not just first-class passengers, but people from all areas of the ship. Third-class passengers who had made their way up from the lower decks, crew members whose regular duties no longer served any purpose, and second-class passengers who found themselves caught between the organized evacuation procedures of first class and other complications. The mood in this gathering was subdued, but not panicked. There was an almost surreal quality to the scene. as if everyone was participating in some elaborate historical reenactment rather than facing actual serious circumstances. People stood in small groups, talking quietly, some praying, others simply observing the dark water that surrounded the ship. Father Thomas Biles, a Catholic priest traveling to New York to officiate at his brother's wedding, had begun conducting an impromptu religious service. Passengers of all denominations, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, and others, gathered on the tilting deck as he offered prayers and spiritual comfort. His voice strong and clear despite the wind and the sounds of the ship, provided an anchor of calm in the surrounding activity. "Into your hands, O Lord, I place my trust," he intoned. And dozens of voices repeated the ancient words. For many of these people, these would be among the last prayers they would speak, final communications between themselves and whatever divine presence they believed governed human affairs. The ship's lights flickered momentarily, the first clear sign that the electrical systems were being affected by the flooding. The generators were located well above the waterline, but the switchboards and distribution systems in the lower areas of the ship were beginning to experience difficulties as water reached critical components. When the lights stabilized again, they seemed dimmer, more yellow than the bright white illumination passengers had grown accustomed to near the ship's gymnasium. Some passengers had gathered around the exercise equipment in what seemed like an attempt to maintain some sense of normalcy. The mechanical horses, rowing machines, and other apparatus that had served as amusing diversions during the voyage now functioned as gathering points for people who simply weren't sure what else to do with themselves. Thomas Macaulay, the ship's physical instructor, continued to wear his spotless white flannel uniform and maintain his professional demeanor even as water began affecting the deck below his facility. His dedication to his post, his refusal to abandon his responsibilities even under these extraordinary circumstances, represented another example of the complex human responses to this developing crisis. The final lifeboats were being prepared for launching, though there was some uncertainty about exactly how many boats remained. The collapsible boats, designated as boats A and B, were still secured to the roof of the officers' quarters, requiring considerable effort to free them and position them for launching. Crew members worked intensively with tools to cut through the ropes and rigging, but time was becoming increasingly important. Officer Herod Bride, one of the ship's radio operators, emerged from the communication room with an update that spread quickly among the remaining passengers. The radio equipment was still functioning, and they were continuing to transmit distress calls to any ships that might be in the area. But the news wasn't entirely encouraging. The nearest vessel that can provide assistance is still the Carpathia, he reported to an officer, unaware that his words were being overheard by concerned passengers. "She's making maximum speed, but won't reach us for several more hours. The Frankfurt acknowledges our calls, but she's even further away. The Californian," he paused, frustration clear in his voice. "The Californian doesn't respond. A radio operator appears to have ended operations for the night." Several hours, looking around at the sinking ship, at the water now visible on the forward well deck, at the steep angle the vessel had developed, it was clear that several hours represented a significant time period under these circumstances. The ship was settling by the bow at an accelerating rate, and basic naval architecture suggested that when the water reached certain critical points, developments would occur very quickly. The list had become severe enough that maintaining footing required constant attention. Loose objects weren't just sliding. They were moving with gathering speed as gravity took control of anything not securely fastened. A deck chair broke free from its moorings and slid past with increasing velocity, heading for the railing and the sea beyond. The sound it made when it finally went over the side seemed unusually loud in the relative quiet of the night. Passengers looked up at the stars, brilliant and clear in the unpolluted air far from any city lights. The celestial display was breathtaking. thousands of points of light scattered across the velvet darkness of the sky. It was heartbreakingly beautiful. This cosmic show that was being performed for an audience that included many people seeing stars with new appreciation. Observers tried to memorize the patterns, thinking that if by some chance they survived this night, they would never look at the night sky the same way again. A disturbance near the remaining lifeboats drew attention back to more immediate concerns. A group of men, clearly third-class passengers based on their clothing and accents, had made their way up from the lower decks and were requesting access to the boats. Their urgency had a different quality that contrasted with the resigned acceptance observers had witnessed among the first-class passengers. "We paid our fare same as anyone," one of them called out to Officer Lightler, his voice carrying the accent of rural Ireland. "Our money's as good as theirs. We have rights to those boats." Lightler, overwhelmed by the situation and trying to maintain some semblance of order, while the last boats were prepared, attempted to maintain the procedures he had been following all night. But observers could see the breakdown of normal social structures happening in real time when survival was at stake. The polite conventions that governed ordinary social interaction began to lose some of their power. The temperature had continued dropping throughout the night, and ice was beginning to form on the ship's superstructure where spray from the increasingly agitated sea hit metal surfaces. Everyone's hands, even inside leather gloves, were becoming numb, making simple tasks like gripping railings more difficult. The cold was penetrating through all layers of clothing, and passengers realized that even this Arctic discomfort was nothing compared to what awaited in the water. Around 2 a.m., the ship's electrical system failed completely for nearly 30 seconds. In those moments of absolute darkness, the silence was profound and concerning. No engines, no electrical hum, no artificial lighting, just the sound of water and wind and the creaking of a ship under stress. When the lights flickered back to life, they seemed dimmer and less stable than before, as if the generators were struggling against increasingly difficult conditions. The final lifeboat, Collapsible Boat A, was finally freed from its lashings and positioned for launching. But by now, the ship's list had become so severe that traditional launching procedures were nearly impossible. The boat davits were designed to operate with the ship in normal trim, not tilted at increasingly extreme angles. The crew worked desperately to adapt their procedures to circumstances that no training had prepared them for. Water was now clearly visible on a deck, the highest level of passenger accommodations. Staterooms that cost small fortunes were taking on seawater, transforming luxury into potential debris. The ship's response to this invasion became more dramatic as structural elements reached their design limits and began to experience stresses they were never meant to withstand. Around 2:10 a.m., the ship's wireless finally went silent. The radio operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, had maintained their posts far longer than duty or reasonable self-preservation would require. But the electrical power could no longer reach the radio room consistently, and the equipment that had been sending desperate pleas for help across hundreds of miles of ocean was finally overwhelmed by the rising water. With the radio silent, the Titanic's electronic voice, that urgent call for help that had been reaching out across the Atlantic for over 3 hours, was stilled forever. Any rescue ship still racing toward the scene would have to navigate to the last known position, without further guidance from the vessel in distress. Father Biles continued his religious services, now joined by other clergy who were aboard, and a growing congregation of passengers seeking spiritual comfort in these final hours. The hymns they sang, "Abide with me, Eternal Father, strong to save, nearer my God to thee," took on meanings their composers never intended when sung by people facing profound uncertainty. The orchestra, which had been playing almost continuously for over 3 hours, began what would be their final performance. There was later debate among survivors about what their last song was. Some remembered, "Nearer my God to thee." Others were called autumn or song d'automne. But the specific melody mattered less than the fact that 8 men, facing an uncertain situation, chose to spend their remaining time making music for others. Wallace Hartley, the bandmaster, had told friends before the voyage that if he ever found himself on a ship in crisis, he would play Nearer My God to Thee as his final act, whether he kept that promise or not. His decision, and that of his fellow musicians, to provide comfort through music in humanity's challenging hour represented one of the most poignant examples of choosing service over self-preservation. The ship's angle became so steep that normal movement was impossible. Passengers who hadn't already found places in lifeboats were now holding onto railings and bulkheads, trying to maintain position on decks that sloped at increasingly severe angles. Loose objects that hadn't already slid away were now moving with dangerous speed, creating hazards for anyone in their path. The massive funnels, those towering smokestacks, that had been symbols of the ship's power and majesty, began to show signs of structural stress. The forward funnel, in particular, was swaying ominously as the cables and braces that supported it were stretched beyond their design limits by the ship's extreme angle. Near the stern, where the deck angle was less severe, the largest concentration of remaining passengers had gathered. These were mostly men, steerage passengers who couldn't reach the boat deck in time, crew members whose duties kept them aboard, and first-class passengers who had given up their places in boats to help. Women and children. There were also women and children who either couldn't get to the boats or chose not to leave family members behind. The mood among this final group was remarkable for its calmness. There was no mass panic, no violence, no complete breakdown of civilized behavior. Instead, there was a kind of resigned dignity, as if everyone understood that they were participating in something larger than individual tragedy. They were witnessing and participating in a test of human character under ultimate pressure. Some passengers were writing final messages, though. They had no idea how these communications might ever reach their intended recipients. Others were sharing personal items, photographs, jewelry, mementos, with strangers who might have better chances of survival. These exchanges weren't about material value, but about ensuring that some trace of their lives might continue beyond this night. The ship's structural integrity began to fail more dramatically around 2:17 a.m. The forward section of the vessel had taken on so much water that it was pulling the rest of the ship down with it, creating stresses that even the finest steel of 1912 could not withstand. The sound of metal under extreme stress, rivets failing, and bulkheads giving way created a thunderous noise that could be heard even over the wind and waves. But it wasn't just the sound that was concerning. It was the feel of the ship experiencing structural changes beneath everyone's feet. The deck shuddered and flexed as fundamental structural elements reached their limits. Everything loose moved toward the bow in a symphony of displacement that included furniture, equipment, machinery, and anything else that wasn't permanently attached to the ship's structure. The forward funnel, weakened by the extreme angle and the failure of its supporting structures, finally broke free with a sound like thunder. It crashed into the sea with tremendous force, taking with it anyone unlucky enough to be in its path. The collapse of this massive structure, weighing hundreds of tons, emphasized the complete transformation of everything that had seemed solid and permanent about this floating city. Now the ship's final crisis became violent and chaotic. The lights failed permanently, plunging everything into absolute darkness broken only by starlight. Without electrical illumination, the night became disorienting and challenging. Passengers could hear the sounds of structural failure, steel plates under stress, machinery breaking free, people calling out, but they could not see what was happening around them. The deck tilted past the point where any kind of normal stance was possible. Everyone still aboard found themselves sliding toward the bow, unable to maintain footing on surfaces that now sloped at impossible angles. The ship seemed to pause. For a moment, balanced impossibly between floating and sinking, between stability and crisis, as if even the laws of physics were having difficulty accepting what was happening. Then came the sound that survivors would remember for the rest of their lives, the noise of everything inside the ship breaking free simultaneously. Pianos, furniture, the massive boilers in the engine room, every piece of machinery and equipment not permanently attached to the fundamental structure of the vessel, all sliding forward in a tremendous crescendo of destruction. This was the moment when passengers realized that the choice between staying with the ship and entering the water was no longer theirs to make. The ship was taking everyone with her, whether they wanted to go or not. The stern rose higher and higher until it was nearly vertical, creating an impossible tower of steel hanging in the air before beginning its final descent toward the ocean floor 2.5 miles below. People had perhaps 30 seconds before they hit the water. 30 seconds to prepare mentally and physically for what might be the most challenging experience of their lives, if they were fortunate enough to survive the initial shock of immersion in water that was extremely cold. The impact with the North Atlantic was shocking beyond description. Every nerve in everyone's body responded simultaneously as water at near freezing temperatures enveloped them completely. The shock was so intense that it was difficult to think coherently. Automatic body reflexes took over completely, gasping and struggling in response to temperature trauma unlike anything human beings are designed to withstand. Life jackets brought people to the surface, but they found themselves breathing uncontrollably, their respiratory systems overwhelmed by the cold shock response. This involuntary reaction was one of the most dangerous aspects of sudden cold water immersion. It could cause people to inhale water and face serious difficulties within the first few minutes, before other challenges became primary threats. The water around survivors was filled with hundreds of other people experiencing the same physiological crisis. Their voices created a sound unlike anything in human experience. Not quite screaming, not exactly crying, but a collective expression of shock and desperate hope that somehow, against all logic and probability, rescue might still be possible. Debris from the ship surrounded everyone. Deck chairs, life rings, pieces of wood paneling, personal belongings that represented interrupted lives and broken dreams. Some of this debris provided additional flotation, helping to keep people at the surface who might otherwise struggle to remain afloat in their heavy, waterlogged clothing. The cold began its attack on everyone's core temperature immediately. Hands and feet started to lose sensation within the first few minutes, and fine motor control became increasingly difficult. Simple actions like gripping floating debris or adjusting life jackets required enormous effort as muscles stopped responding normally to commands from brains. But the human body has remarkable survival mechanisms, and adrenaline flooded everyone's systems in response to this ultimate crisis. Heart rates increased dramatically as bodies fought to maintain core temperature and blood pressure. For these first few minutes, people were functioning on pure survival instinct and chemical enhancement that allowed them to do things that would be impossible under normal circumstances. The lights from the lifeboats were visible in the distance, small points of hope in the vast darkness. They seemed impossibly far away, though survivors knew some were probably only a few hundred yards off, in water this cold. With bodies rapidly losing the ability to function normally, a few hundred yards represented a significant distance. Survivors tried to swim toward the nearest lights, but movement through the water was becoming increasingly difficult. Heavy clothing, which had seemed essential for warmth just hours ago, now created drag like anchors. Each stroke required more energy than people felt capable of providing, and the distance to the boats didn't seem to be decreasing despite their efforts. Other people in the water were calling out, some to the lifeboats, pleading for rescue, others to companions they could hear but not see in the darkness. Some were praying aloud, their voices becoming weaker as the minutes passed and the cold did its relentless work on human physiology. The most challenging aspect of this situation was how quickly hope could fade. In the first few minutes after entering the water, rescue seemed possible. People could see the lights, hear voices from the boats, imagine being pulled to safety. But as body temperatures dropped and strength diminished, the possibility of survival became increasingly remote. Survivors spotted pieces of wooden debris floating nearby, parts of doors or wall panels from some of the ship's interior spaces. These weren't large enough to support full body weight, but they might provide some insulation from direct contact with the water and give people something stable to hold on to while conserving energy. Reaching the debris required the last of coordinated swimming ability. Muscles were no longer responding reliably to conscious commands, and each movement felt delayed and clumsy. But many managed to reach wooden panels and pull themselves partially onto their surfaces, reducing the amount of their bodies that were directly immersed in the killing cold. The improvement was marginal but significant, with less of their bodies in direct contact with the water. Heat loss slowed slightly, and they had something solid to grip that didn't require constant swimming motions to maintain position. But they were still immersed to their chests in water that continued to pull vital warmth from their cores with ruthless efficiency. Time became meaningless in the water. Minutes felt like hours. Yet survivors were surprised to realize that voices around them were growing noticeably quieter. People who were calling for help just a short time ago had fallen silent, succumbing to the cold or to despair, or to the simple exhaustion of trying to maintain hope under hopeless circumstances. Individual voices were weakening as well. When survivors tried to call out to the distant lifeboats, the words came out as barely audible whispers. Throats felt frozen, vocal cords unable to produce the volume necessary to carry over the sound of wind and waves. The concept of rescue was becoming abstract, a pleasant fantasy rather than a realistic possibility. But then, cutting through the haze of cold and exhaustion that was beginning to cloud thinking, survivors heard something that made hearts leap. With desperate hope, the rhythmic sound of oars cutting through water, purposeful and organized, growing steadily closer, someone had made the decision to return, to row back into the debris field where survivors might still be found. The lifeboat materialized out of the darkness like a vision. It was lifeboat number 14, under the command of 5th Officer Harold Lowe, who had made the difficult and dangerous decision to go back and look for survivors. Many of the women in his boat had argued against returning, fearing that desperate people in the water might swamp their boat in a panic to climb aboard. Lowe had waited until the voices from the water had diminished significantly, a calculated decision based on the assumption that only those with the strength to wait patiently for rescue, rather than those who might panic, would still be conscious. It was a harsh but practical decision that represented the difference between saving a few lives and potentially losing many more. Here, survivors tried to call out. The voices produced only weak sounds. They waved as vigorously as numbed arms allowed, praying that the boat's crew would spot their movement in the darkness. Every gesture sent waves of discomfort through muscles that had nearly ceased functioning, but this might be their only chance. Strong hands reached down to pull people from the water, and the process seemed to take forever. Waterlogged clothing and numb muscles made survivors dead weight that the boat's crew struggled to lift clear of the sea. For terrifying moments, some thought they might not be able to complete the rescue, that they might slip back into the water after coming so close to safety. But finally, miraculously, survivors found themselves lying in the bottom of the lifeboat, water streaming from their clothes, their bodies shaking so violently that they could barely speak. The other occupants of the boat worked immediately to help them, sharing blankets and body warmth. Though everyone was desperately cold and there were no truly warm, dry garments available, Officer Lowe continued rowing among the debris field, searching for other survivors, but the sounds from the water had become sporadic and weak. The cold had done its work with brutal efficiency. In less than an hour after the ship's final plunge, the North Atlantic had claimed the vast majority of those who entered its waters. Survivors drifted in and out of consciousness as their bodies slowly began the process of recovering from extreme cold exposure. The lifeboat rose and fell with the ocean swells, and occasionally they caught glimpses of other boats scattered. Across the dark water, small islands of humanity in a vast, indifferent sea, the hours until dawn stretched endlessly. Without the protection of the ship's bulk to block the wind, the lifeboats were exposed to the full force of North Atlantic weather. Waves washed over the sides regularly, adding to the misery of people already soaked and freezing. Some passengers showed signs of frostbite on their extremities, while others displayed symptoms of more serious cold-related injuries. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the eastern horizon began to show the first hints of color change that indicated approaching daylight. Dawn was coming, bringing with it not just improved visibility, but the psychological boost that comes with surviving through the night. The darkness that had hidden so much tragedy would soon reveal the full scope of what had occurred. As the sun rose, survivors got their first clear look at the other people in their lifeboat. Their faces showed the same mixture of grief, exhaustion, and profound gratitude that everyone felt. Some they recognized from the ship's dining rooms and social areas. Others were crew members they'd seen only in passing. All were bound together now by their shared experience of surviving something that seemed unsurvivable. The debris field revealed by daylight stretched as far as anyone could see. Life jackets, pieces of wood, items of clothing, and personal belongings floated on the surface like a maritime cemetery. But of the great ship herself, the floating palace that had been home to over 2,200 people just hours ago, there was no trace whatsoever. The Titanic had vanished as completely as if she had never existed. Around 8:30 a.m., a shout went up from one of the other lifeboats on the horizon. Black smoke was visible against the morning sky, the distinctive plume that could only mean a steamship approaching at maximum speed. The Carpathia had finally arrived, having raced through dangerous ice fields throughout the night to reach the disaster scene as quickly as humanly possible. The rescue process took several hours as each lifeboat had to be located and its occupants brought safely aboard the rescue vessel. Many survivors were among the last to be taken aboard, and by the time strong arms pulled them up the ship's side and onto the Carpathia's deck, they had been in the lifeboats for over 8 hours. Captain Arthur Rostron and his crew had prepared extensively for this rescue operation during their race across the Atlantic. They had converted dying areas into emergency medical stations, prepared hot food and warm clothing for survivors, and organized systems for providing immediate assistance to people who had endured unimaginable trauma. The crew of the Carpathia treated every survivor with extraordinary compassion and professionalism. Medical personnel examined everyone for signs of hypothermia, frostbite, and other cold-related injuries. Stewards provided dry clothing and hot beverages, while other crew members worked to make sleeping arrangements for people who were physically and emotionally exhausted. But no amount of kindness or medical attention could address the psychological impact of what survivors had experienced. They had watched a floating city disappear into the ocean. They had heard the sounds of over 1,000 people facing challenges in water so cold it proved fatal within minutes. They had survived something that would forever change their understanding of human mortality, natural forces, and the relationship between technology and the environment. The other survivors on the Carpathia reacted to their experiences in different ways. Some talked compulsively, as if by telling and retelling their stories, they could somehow process the magnitude of what occurred. Others withdrew into themselves, barely speaking except when directly questioned. A few seemed to recover quickly on the surface, but observers suspected the true psychological impact wouldn't be felt for months or years to come. As the Carpathia turned toward New York, carrying The survivors away from the scene of the disaster. Many stood at the stern rail looking back at the empty ocean. The water that claimed so many lives looked peaceful in the morning sunlight, giving no sign of the drama that played out on its surface during the night. But they knew that beneath those deceptively calm waves lay the wreck of human ambition and technological pride. The journey to New York took 3 days, during which survivors slowly began to process what they had experienced and lost. They thought about the people who didn't make it. Mrs. Strauss, who chose to stay with her husband rather than leave without him. Benjamin Guggenheim, who dressed for crisis like a gentleman attending an elegant social function. Father Biles, who gave his life jacket to another passenger and stayed aboard to provide final comfort to those who couldn't be saved. Their courage in the face of certain danger represented the best of human nature, even as the disaster itself demonstrated humanity's capacity for tragic miscalculation. The ship was supposed to be unsinkable, designed with the most advanced safety features available, yet it foundered on its maiden voyage, undone by a combination of overconfidence, inadequate safety regulations, and the simple physics of ice and steel. Survivors also thought about the crew members who stayed at their posts despite having no hope of personal benefit. The engineers who kept the electrical power running until the very end, ensuring that the ship's lights continued to function and that the wireless could continue transmitting distress calls. The postal workers who tried to save the mail in the flooded mailroom. The musicians who played music to comfort passengers. During the final hours, these weren't acts of heroism in the dramatic sense. They weren't trying to perform grand gestures that would be remembered by history. They were simply people doing their jobs, maintaining their responsibilities to others, even when self-preservation would have been completely understandable and morally justified. The wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, had stayed at their posts far longer than duty required, continuing to send distress calls even as water rose around their equipment. Phillips didn't survive. He was last seen working frantically to maintain communication with potential rescue ships. Bride made it to one of the collapsible boats, but suffered severe frostbite to his feet during his time in the water. When the Carpathia finally docked in New York on the evening of April 18th, massive crowds had gathered to meet the survivors. The story of the Titanic had captured the world's imagination, becoming more than just a maritime disaster, but a symbol of the dangers of overconfidence and the fragility of human achievements when they encounter the raw forces of nature. As survivors walked down the gangplank and set foot on solid ground, for the first time in over a week, they realized that they were not the same people who had boarded the Titanic in Southampton. The experience had fundamentally changed them in ways that they were still beginning to understand. They had seen human nature stripped to its essentials under the most extreme circumstances possible. They had witnessed both cowardice and heroism, selfishness and sacrifice, panic and calm, acceptance. They had learned that social conventions and class distinctions meant little when survival became immediate and personal. They had seen how some people, when faced with their own mortality, chose to spend their final moments helping others rather than fighting uselessly against the inevitable. The disaster had also taught them something profound about the relationship between human technology and the natural world. The ocean didn't sink the Titanic out of malice or conscious intent. It simply existed according to its own physical laws. When human engineering encountered conditions beyond its design parameters, those laws proved more powerful than any amount of steel, money, or confidence. The water temperature that night was near freezing, cold enough to present serious challenges to anyone immersed in it. No amount of courage, social status, or wealth could change that basic biological reality. In the end, the ocean reduced everyone to the same fundamental equation: body heat versus water temperature. And water temperature proved dominant for all but those fortunate enough to find places in the lifeboats in the days and weeks that followed their return to New York. survivors began to understand how the disaster had affected them psychologically. They woke up sometimes thinking they were back in that lifeboat, surrounded by the sounds of people facing challenges in water too cold for human survival. They felt guilt about surviving when so many others didn't, even though they understood rationally that survival was largely a matter of chance and circumstance. But they also carried positive memories from that night. The orchestra playing hymns as the ship settled beneath their feet. Father Biles offering spiritual comfort to anyone who wanted it. The crew members who maintained their duties even when their own safety became impossible to ensure. The passengers who helped strangers, shared resources, and chose dignity over desperation in their final moments. Years later, as the initial shock faded and the world moved on to other disasters and tragedies, survivors still woke up occasionally with the sounds of that night echoing in their memory. But they also remembered the remarkable demonstrations of human goodness that occurred alongside the tragedy. People who chose to help others rather than focusing solely on their own survival. Families who found ways to show love and support. Even when facing separation and uncertainty, the Titanic disaster became a watershed moment in maritime safety, leading to immediate improvements in regulations governing lifeboat capacity, RDIO communication protocols, and ice patrol services. The tragedy that cost so many lives ultimately contributed to saving countless others through improved safety standards and emergency procedures. But perhaps more importantly, the disaster provided lessons about human character under ultimate stress. The stories of courage, sacrifice, and mutual aid that emerged from that night offered inspiration that extended far beyond maritime safety into broader questions about how people and communities respond to crisis. The ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, had created a vessel that represented the pinnacle of early 20th century maritime engineering. While the ship ultimately couldn't survive its encounter with the ice field, many of the safety features he had incorporated: the watertight compartments, the advanced communication systems. The lifeboat Davids had provided crucial time for evacuation procedures that saved hundreds of lives. Andrews himself chose to spend his final hours helping passengers and crew, providing assistance and encouragement, even when he knew his creation was doomed. He was last seen in the first-class smoking room, staring at a painting titled Plymouth Harbor, having given his life jacket to another passenger. His dedication to helping others, rather than wallowing in the failure of his design, spoke to a nobility of character that transcended professional disappointment. The orchestra's final performance remains one of the most poignant symbols of the disaster. 8 men, facing certain danger, chose to spend their remaining time making music for others. Whether their last song was "Nearer My God to Thee," "Autumn," or something else entirely mattered less than the fact that they continued to provide beauty and comfort until the very end. Wallace Hartley, the bandleader, had once told friends that if he were ever on a ship in crisis, he would play "Nearer My God to Thee" as his final act. Whether he fulfilled that promise or not, his decision and that of his fellow musicians represented one of the purest examples of choosing service to others over self-preservation. In comfortable beds now, decades later, people can appreciate both the tragedy and the triumph of that night. The loss of life was terrible and largely preventable. Better safety regulations, more lifeboats, improved ice detection systems, more rigorous safety protocols could have prevented the disaster or dramatically reduced its impact. But within the tragedy were remarkable demonstrations of human resilience, compassion, and dignity. The disaster revealed both the limitations of human technology and the unlimited capacity of the human spirit to find meaning and purpose, even in the face of ultimate challenges. The stories from that night continue to resonate because they address fundamental questions about how people behave when all pretense is stripped away and they face the ultimate test. Some chose heroism, some chose sacrifice, some simply chose to maintain their humanity and help others when help became the only meaningful action available. As people drift towards sleep in their warm, safe beds, they can carry with them both the sobering lessons and the inspiring examples from that April night in 1912. The ocean remains vast and powerful, governed by physical laws that operate without regard for human convenience or ambition. Ice and cold and the fundamental forces of displacement and buoyancy continue to operate, according to principles that no amount of engineering or wealth can overcome. But we can also remember that humans, when confronted with circumstances completely beyond their control, have repeatedly demonstrated remarkable capacity for courage, creativity, and compassion. The survivors of the Titanic didn't just live through a disaster. They provided examples of how people can maintain their essential humanity even under conditions that seem designed to test it. The ship rests now on the ocean floor, 2.5 miles below the surface, slowly deteriorating in the cold, dark depths. She has become a monument to both human achievement and human limitations, a reminder that our greatest technological accomplishments remain subject to forces larger than ourselves. The water above the wreck has long since returned to its natural state, showing no sign of the drama that once played out on its surface. Ships pass over the site regularly now, their passengers unaware of the history beneath them. But the stories of that night, stories of loss and survival, fear and courage, despair and hope, continue to offer lessons about resilience, community, and the power of individuals to choose how they respond to ultimate adversity. The cold that night was near freezing, cold enough to present serious challenges, but not cold enough to freeze the human capacity for love, sacrifice, and mutual aid. The darkness was complete when the ship's lights failed, but not complete enough to extinguish the light of human compassion and dignity that shone brightest in the deepest shadow. Close your eyes now and let yourself settle into that safe, warm space where cold water and sinking ships are just stories from the past. You're protected here by solid walls and warm blankets, surrounded by the comfort and security that the passengers of 1912 would have considered miraculous. But carry with you their example of how to face the unthinkable with grace, how to find meaning in impossible circumstances, and how to choose hope over despair, even when hope seems difficult to maintain. The stars that shone that night are still there. Undimmed by time or tragedy, they witness both the most challenging and most noble aspects of human nature, and they continue to shine over a world where people still face circumstances that test their character and their commitment to one another. Rest now, knowing that you are part of that continuing story of human resilience, and that somewhere in your own life, you too will have opportunities to choose courage over fear, service over self-interest, and hope over despair. The water was cold. The night was dark. The ship was lost. But the human spirit, that indefinable quality that allows people to find light in darkness and warmth in cold, proved truly unsinkable after all.